Love built on deception is bound to crumble. Edward's story serves as a reminder that no matter how much you sacrifice or how deeply you care, trust is fragile, and once broken, it may never be the same again. When betrayal enters a relationship, sometimes the hardest lesson is knowing when to let go and prioritize your own healing. The first thing Edward noticed was the silence. It was unnerving, the usual hum of the house, the distant chatter of kids, the muffled sound of the TV had vanished. The room felt heavy, like the calm before a storm, and the air was thick with something he couldn't quite place. Edward stared at his phone, watching as the location pin flickered again. She wasn't at work. His heart raced, pounding in his chest. The AirTag he had secretly planted under Laura's car had revealed what he had feared for months. Laura wasn't where she said she would be, and the GPS dot was now in a part of town Edward didn't recognize. His mind swirled with confusion, anger, and dread as his thoughts raced back to every small change he'd noticed. The late nights, the cold distance, her immaculate appearance before leaving the house. His throat tightened as realization began to set in. Something was very, very wrong. Edward stood frozen in the middle of the room, torn between confronting her now or letting the truth come to light on its own. But deep down, he knew tonight would change everything. Edward had always believed that love, commitment, and sacrifice would keep his marriage afloat through any storm. At 39, his life with Laura, 38, and their 3 children seemed as stable as a marriage of 9 years could be. They had their ups and downs, as any couple did, but Edward never anticipated the emotional hurricane that would tear through their lives. Over the summer, Laura's demeanor began to shift. She had been promoted at work, a move that came with immense pressure and responsibilities. Edward noticed how stressed she'd become, her graveyard shifts taking a toll on her mental health, leaving her exhausted and irritable. He tried his best to be the supportive husband. Whenever Laura came home grumpy or vented about her day, Edward listened, never taking it personally. He understood that her workload was intense, and he chalked up her outbursts to stress. But as the months passed, something about Laura's behavior didn't sit right with Edward. He noticed subtle changes, things that might have gone unnoticed to anyone else. She was paying more attention to her appearance before work. What used to be a quick grab of a ponytail and scrubs had turned into careful makeup application and fitted outfits. She was withdrawn, almost distant, no longer telling Edward about her day or sharing even the smallest details about work. Their conversations became fewer and more strained. Then there were the fights. Laura would lash out at Edward for the smallest things, her irritation spilling over into shouting matches that left Edward feeling blindsided. He couldn't understand where her anger was coming from, but he loved her. He had always loved her, so he attributed it to the stress of her job. But deep down, a seed of suspicion had been planted. By November, the emotional distance between them had grown to a chasm. Laura was working nonstop, and the time they spent together dwindled to almost nothing. The few moments they had were fraught with tension, and Edward couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. He thought back to her increasingly cold attitude, her long hours, and her sudden disinterest in their family life. And then it hit him like a cold gust of wind. There was someone else. One night, after touring a potential school for their daughter, another fight erupted. Edward had been looking forward to spending some rare time together, but Laura, without any explanation, announced that she had to work. Edward felt the frustration and resentment build up inside him. His mind raced. Was this really work, or was she slipping away to be with someone else? That night, consumed by doubt, Edward asked Laura point blank if there was someone else. She denied it, of course, vehemently. Laura called him crazy, accusing him of being paranoid and insecure. But her defensive response only fueled Edward's suspicions. In the weeks that followed, Edward's mind became a battlefield of fear and mistrust. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was being lied to. The stress was eating him alive, but he needed proof, something concrete. That's when he did something desperate. He bought an AirTag, taping it under her car in a last-ditch effort to uncover the truth. Days passed, and Laura's behavior grew more erratic. She was hanging out with friends Edward didn't approve of, disregarding his feelings entirely. They fought again, and this time Laura stormed out, claiming she was calling into work. But Edward knew better. Later that night, Edward watched as the AirTag's location pinged on his phone, not at work, but at a random apartment. He felt his heart stop. The truth was undeniable. Laura had gone to another man's place and spent the night. After 13 years of marriage, 3 children, and countless memories, she had betrayed him in the worst way possible. When Edward confronted her, Laura's response was as cold as it was shocking. "I wanted attention." She confessed that she had been talking to the other man for months, opening up to him in ways she claimed she couldn't with Edward. The emotional connection had blossomed into something physical. Edward couldn't believe what he was hearing. The woman he had built his life with, the mother of his children, had sought comfort in another man's arms. His heart shattered. How could she do this? How could she rip their family apart for someone who meant nothing? Despite the betrayal, Edward didn't give up easily. They tried therapy, long conversations, and endless tears. Edward poured his heart out, hoping to salvage whatever remained of their broken marriage. But nothing changed. Laura was still in communication with the other man, and the distance between her and Edward only widened. Months passed, and Edward found himself a shell of the man he once was. The betrayal had left scars that would never fully heal. He had given everything to this relationship, only to have it torn apart by lies and deception. The final blow came when Laura, despite everything, continued to choose the other man. It was over. Now, sitting in the silence of his empty home, Edward is haunted by the memories of what they once had. He replayed every moment in his mind, trying to pinpoint where things went wrong, how the woman he loved could do this to him. The pain was unbearable, but so was the anger. Edward wasn't just heartbroken, he was furious. The revenge came slowly. Edward wasn't a man to lash out impulsively. Instead, he began making quiet, calculated moves. He hired a lawyer, started documenting everything, and made sure that when the time came, he would be ready to fight for full custody of their children. If Laura wanted to tear their family apart, she would face the consequences. The twists and turns that had brought him to this moment were nothing short of devastating, but Edward had learned something along the way. People are unpredictable, and even those closest to you can become strangers overnight. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal. It was accepting that the woman he loved no longer existed in the way he once knew her. As Edward prepares for the next chapter of his life, the story of betrayal, heartbreak, and revenge will forever linger in his mind. But one thing is certain: he will never let anyone take advantage of his heart again.